Hello watch enthusiasts, and welcome to Watch Chronicler Unscripted, the podcast available on SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes, and of course on YouTube as a full video. And today I'd like to speak about Hamilton. Hamilton is, in my opinion, the strangest brand owned by the Swatch Group. This is a brand which has a very wide and somewhat confusing heritage, because when it was separate from parent ownership from that Swiss company, it was true to say that they tried to move with the market, and as a result lost some of their brand identity. I'll explain this later in the podcast. But the aim of this podcast is really to understand what Hamilton is. Are they an American brand? Are they a Swiss brand? Are they a brand competing with Longines, or are they more of a Tissot competitor? What actually do they represent? Because Hamilton tends to be a watch brand praised for certain models in their collection, whilst there's an extensive range of others which get no attention whatsoever. You see, this consideration started a few days ago when I was looking online for the most discounted mid-range watches on the market, because really it made me curious, because there's a lot of analysis on discounted luxury watches, but watches with the mechanical Swiss movement sitting beneath the £1,000 mark tend to be ignored a bit in this regard. And I was taken, after a bit of searching, to the TK Maxx website, the very well-known seller of discounted goods or goods which haven't been sold by their main seller. And I found a rather nice Hamilton GMT Pilot's piece rotating bezel, a piece which really should be a £1,000 watch, selling for £300. And this surprised me, quite honestly. I also found one of their naval pieces, one of their khaki navy pieces, which celebrate the marine chronometers produced by Hamilton in the past, and their involvement particularly with the US Navy. And that was a watch which should be an £800 piece selling for £250. And I was staggered that such discounts were actually available, but thinking about Hamilton, perhaps it shouldn't come as quite such a surprise. Before I begin, please remember that you can find all of these podcasts and plenty of full articles and reviews on watchchronicler.com, the real centre of Watch Chronicler. Also, head over to YouTube if you're listening to this as a podcast to see more videos, and of course remember to head over to our Instagram page to always receive the latest updates, with a different attitude and a different perspective on the watches we all love. But how should one begin talking about this strangest brand in the Swatch portfolio? Well, I think that Hamilton is an unlikely addition in the first place to the Swatch collection, just because of its placement amongst the brands owned by the group. At the bottom end, of course, you have Tissot, Mido, Certina, but Tissot, I think, would be the primary brand at the bottom end of Swatch for a mechanical Swiss watch, because it's a fantastic entry point to owning a mechanical Swiss watch. The pieces aren't particularly complicated, and it's only in the higher levels of the brand that you see really attractive detailing and also impressive movements. But they're a brand with a very strong reputation, a very good history, and a fantastic function for the group. And in many ways, Hamilton is competing with those very brands, with sub-£1,000 pricing for a lot of their watches, and specifications which are in many cases very similar to those. But they also have watches costing £2,500 or even £3,000, which simply don't have the technology to compete with the Swatch Group brands operating in that level. Even a £1,500 Longines will be a better finished, higher level watch in many ways than a more expensive Hamilton, and of course Omega doesn't even bear consideration because that's a Rolex competitor. But certainly Hamilton sits in an odd place between all of these brands, without really any price range to dominate. Then of course you have the strange matter of their scattergun approach to product releases, because you have so many directions to see from the brand. You have vintage European sporting style like the Pan-Europe, American military style in the khaki collection, touches of aviation with their pilots models from an era when they didn't design the styles of watches which they produce today, but of course they did have a connection to aviation all the same. And finally you have 50s Americana with watches like the Ventura, which of course was made famous by Elvis Presley during his moments of fame. To add to this strangeness, Hamilton is most well known recently, certainly in the media, for its two major lawsuits, one during which it was sued and the other during which it sued another brand. The first and more stupid of the two cases, in my opinion, was the one in which Lewis Hamilton, the Formula One driver, sued them in order to stop them from using his name on their watches, which, to be quite frank, is a pretty absurd proposition in the first place, given that they are so many times older than he is. And, quite honestly, the level of hubris displayed in the suing of a watch brand in that way strikes me as unbelievable. And clearly Hamilton won, and I don't know if IWC had anything to do with the legal process or any kind of suggestion that perhaps this should take place, and I'm in no place to comment, but certainly that seems like the only obvious reason to try to do this. Then there was the situation during which Hamilton sued Vortic, a brand in America which restores and turns vintage pocket watches and their movements, including their dials, into wristwatches in a very different form, and they were being sued for trademark infringement, counterfeiting, and unfair competition. Ultimately, Vortic won, which I think was a fantastic move for the watch industry because it clarified a lot of the grey areas which still exist, but existed in a way which hadn't been resolved until this case, with regards to the boundaries where restoration and where the alteration of vintage watches is concerned. Thus far, it certainly sounds like I'm being very harsh to Hamilton, with a difficult-to-understand range, as a legal aggressor to smaller brands, and a brand which doesn't really understand its own heritage. But I think a lot of that is explained by its history, so I think it's worth considering that before thinking about anything else about the brand. Because, after all, Hamilton isn't a Swiss brand historically, and in fact isn't even European. It was founded in 1892 in America, in Pennsylvania, and was in many ways in a perfect position with the American watch industry at the time. The American watch industry was becoming a worldwide superpower during that period because Swiss watches, formerly the makers of fairly low-level products by comparison to English and French horology, still had a decentralised and low-volume industry which couldn't put out the numbers of very good quality, it has to be said, watches the American watch industry could during that period. You see, as was the case with cars, America was able to create machine-made watches on much, much larger scales under one roof than the decentralised cottage industry which was the Swiss watch industry. In a funny way, and this is something which is worth remembering as we move forward through the podcast, that, in a sense, this American attitude to watchmaking has become a major part of affordable watchmaking in Switzerland today, and so you can say that in many ways they were ahead of their time, and had it not been for unfortunate circumstances worldwide, the American watch industry still could be blooming. A key contributor to this expansion was the growth of railway lines throughout America, and of course America is very well known for this, but particularly during that period there was a need for chronometers for the train lines to operate from, and so as a result there really was a market for high accuracy pocket watches. The only area which American watchmaking really couldn't touch was complications, because these required the production of very small numbers of very specialised components, something which you can't really do when you're producing watches on a very large scale. By the early 20th century, though, American dominance over watchmaking was falling considerably, and there were a fair number of reasons for this. A key one would be the lack of third-party suppliers of components. And this may seem surprising, but if everything is produced by one manufacturer within the company, if you have any shortage of one part, you are unable to continue production, whereas in a Swiss decentralised industry style, you could easily source the same components from another manufacturer, and so continue production even with these hiccups. There was also a reluctance to change, and this was key when there was the changeover from pocket watches to wristwatches. And whilst Wolven was a brand which didn't move with the times particularly well, Hamilton actually did, and that's perhaps why it existed rather successfully throughout the 20th century. The third reason, and perhaps the most important, was the involvement in the wars, and therefore the requirement for American watchmakers to produce other equipment. And whilst certain brands like Hamilton were able to continue producing watches and timekeeping pieces, it seriously set back the watch industry in America and meant that the Japanese and the Swiss watch industry were in a very, very good place by the 1950s and 1960s. The Swiss industry because it had an awful lot of time to not only fulfill military orders during the wars, but also continue producing and developing luxury watches, and the Japanese industry simply because they couldn't produce weaponry anymore, and so had to go in a different direction for production, and had to achieve a new and very industrious format for the management of the country. Interestingly, Hamilton actually ceased production of commercial watches altogether during both wars, apart from military equipment, and so they are known for their military watches. Certainly they were involved with the production of some of the most interesting military watches for the American armed forces during the Second World War, and of course they're later known for the watches which they sent to Vietnam, and these were watches which were very simple, very legible, hacking, manually wound wristwatches of a field watch variety, which we now see trickle down into their khaki collection in their current range. Hamilton did see a resurgence in the 1950s and the early 60s, because not only did they have rather funky designs during a time when America was very keen to industrially develop, particularly during that 1950s period of some decadence, let's say, or certainly interest and a desire for a brighter future, but this was also a brand keen to pioneer electric watches during that time, and there were quite a few solutions from the American watch industry, many of which are very, very interesting even today to handle and to witness, but by the late 1960s, Japan's mastery of quartz watches, their accuracy, even at a very high price, rendered the American approach to electric watch is pretty much obsolete. But this is the moment when Hamilton demonstrated that actually it really had its finger on the pulse in terms of knowing where the future of the watch industry was going to be. Because between 1966 and 1969, Hamilton moved into Switzerland. That's to say, in 1966 they bought Buren, which was a movement and watch manufacturer in Switzerland, and a brand very well known for their micro-rotor movements. In fact, potentially the first. There's a debate as to whether Universal Genève or Buren produced the first, because their patents were from different periods in the mid-1950s, but that's pretty inconsequential to this podcast. But the benefit of having bought that company for Hamilton was that it was able to move to a far more key place for new watches and new watch development in the world. And by 1969, Hamilton actually closed down their watchmaking facilities in the US altogether and simply used Swiss manufacturing, which made a radical change to their brand image, you could say. All of this work meant that Hamilton was actually at the centre of one of the most important movements of the late 1960s, which was to say the first Swiss automatic chronograph. But the movement which I'd like to speak about is the Calibre 11, which is generally referred to as a Heuer calibre, but it was actually used by Hamilton and a number of other brands because Hamilton and, by extension, Buren produced the basic automatic movement with its micro-rotor onto which the chronograph module and assembly was placed, which is why if you look at the back of a Calibre 11, despite being automatic, you actually can't see the automatic rotor because it's hidden in the centre of the movement. Of course, what you're not told is that the production of that movement was a bit of a shambles. The reason, for example, for the crown being on the wrong side of the movement in relation to the pushers wasn't actually anything mechanical, but it was because of miscommunication between the different brands working on the movement and the fact that they actually weren't allowed to communicate over most things in order to maintain secrecy. Unfortunately, in 1972, Hamilton was put in a very difficult place, and it turns out that demand during those early 70s years, 1970, 1971, 1972, wasn't what they'd expected, and so Buren was rebought by Switzerland from Hamilton. And so Hamilton, now without Buren, was bought by SSIH in 1974, which was the group which would ultimately resurrect the Swiss watch industry in the 1980s and will be renamed the Swatch Group in 1999. The result is that, in a funny way, Hamilton is just as Swiss a brand as it is American. Of course, having a connection to both Switzerland and America is all good and well, but where does that leave a brand? Because certainly it's a very difficult position to be in, given that Hamilton don't really communicate this particularly well. I mean, sure, they have slogans talking about how it's an American spirit with Swiss watchmaking, but in reality it's been Swiss watchmaking for the past 50 or so years, and that's got to change a brand's ideals and approach. Now, of course, there are plenty of cameos of vintage watches within their collection, but it's never been particularly clear whether those are integral to the brand's image or simply trying to bring together the fact that Hamilton doesn't sound Swiss, and yet this is a brand which needs to operate from Switzerland because that is its identity. And when you combine that mixed background with its odd positioning within the Swatch ecosystem and its inclusion of £500 quartz watches and £3,000 mechanical watches in the same range, and more to the point with that £500 quartz watch being more expensive than a Tissot mechanical watch, yet having fairly comparable quality, and results in a very strange place for the brand. Of course, where modern production in their range is concerned, there are plenty of places where someone like me could nitpick, and I suppose I will, but I would like to add the proviso that there are an awful lot of very, very good watches within the Hamilton range. In fact, even the less desirable, I say quote-unquote desirable because this always changes from person to person, but certainly the less publicised models within their range can be some of the best. I've owned a Hamilton Jazzmaster for quite a few years, and it's a really lovely modern men's dress watch. It's a fantastic alternative for someone who likes the appearance of something like an Omega Aquaterra, but simply can't afford that kind of budget, and simply wants to wear a nice watch every day. But to give my commentary on each of the areas of their enormous range of watches, I think you first have to start with the range which is most publicised, which is their vintage sports-style collection, which weirdly falls under the American Classic range, despite the fact that an awful lot of the watches within that range, and in fact all of the most popular ones, are a product of Hamilton's Swiss period, and indeed the period when it actually became a fully Swiss brand. Take, for example, the Intra-Matic chronograph. This range now includes both manual and automatic chronograph watches in a somewhat thick but very appealing, simple 1960s style sports chronograph appearance, and it's a very appealing watch, make no mistake. But it's a confusing watch because they class it as an American classic, and yet it's a watch which was fundamentally created because the original was able to be produced, as a result of Hamilton having a part of that Calibre 11 movement production for the first automatic Swiss chronograph. This also makes the idea of naming the manual version Intra-Matic fairly ridiculous too, because the whole function of the original one was to showcase Hamilton's use of an automatic chronograph. You also have models like that put next to the Chronomatic 50, a piece which celebrates one of the strangest shaped Hamiltons of all time from the early 70s, in a very Speedmaster Mark III Omega style, with the sunray brushed case, the very extensive range of pushers, and a design conceived to celebrate the automatic, high-complexity chronograph offered by the brand in period. Yet when this watch came out, it appeared in the Hamilton catalogue, it became available from suppliers, yet there was absolutely no publication whatsoever about the fact that it had been released. Very, very strange move. I don't know why they did it that way, but it just strikes me as bizarre. And then you find all of these watches, which may be popular if publicised correctly, put next to a model like the Ventura, a real icon of the Hamilton collection, but also one which is very difficult to find in a pure, mechanical, three-hand, everyday configuration. You see complicated versions made to look more sporting, quartz versions designed to be like the electric models from the 50s, but the result is that the range hasn't really been capitalised upon. Next, you have the clear military models, which celebrate Hamilton's American connection to the Navy, to the US Army, with its involvement in, for example, Vietnam, although they don't mention Vietnam too much, I can imagine why. And they bring back pieces like the khaki Field Mechanical, a fantastic watch on all counts, with the possible exception of water resistance, which is a bit low. But these are lovely recreations of vintage pieces, and these are very popular, but the fact that the models which are selling are models like the Field, which are very heavily publicised by magazines, by journalists, because they like them rather than through advertising, and the fact that models like the khaki Navy, a model which, according to what I can find online, is unbelievably heavily discounted, there isn't much advertising work being successful with that range. Whilst addressing these military pieces, you also have to consider the sheer extent of the collection. Look at, for example, the khaki in all of its configurations. There are tens of them, with different cases, different dial configurations, which, whilst offering exactly the same movement and exactly the same functionality on the dial, let's say the day-date complication, can have a price ranging from £500 to £900, with no really obvious reason as to why there is that difference. Then of course you move to the more modern pieces, which are designed to be contemporary and appeal to a modern market like the Jazzmaster or the Frogman, and whilst both are appealing watches, they seem to have nothing stylistically of Hamilton, which again seems like a very difficult sell and seems to be making things more difficult for Hamilton than things need to be. Finally, you have the movie watches, because Hamilton is very involved with supplying watches to be shown in films, and I think this is a fantastic thing to do. It seems like a very wise decision to be able to showcase your watches in the context of an exciting movie. And we've seen models like, for example, the khaki Navy Below Zero in The Martian, which was a film I enjoyed an awful lot, but I did find that the idea of a 1,000-metre dive watch with a dial configuration which is deliberately designed to be stealthy and not legible at all should be a rather strange choice for an astronaut. Then you have watches like, for example, the Hamilton Murph, a watch designed and created just for the film Interstellar, and that was a fantastic opportunity for the brand. It was a watch which was actually involved in the storyline of a very popular and very well-produced film. But they didn't actually put the watch on sale for quite a few years after the film had been released, which seems like a really odd decision, given the popularity of the movie. In some ways one sees a similar level of confusion where movements are concerned, because they offer the H50 movement, which has become a very popular movement within the brand, because it's a very reliable platform, an ETA 28 series movement, which has had a lowered beat rate and an increased power reserve of 80 hours. And this is a similar product you see in Tissot offerings. But it's when you look at chronographs that it becomes surprising that Hamilton is operating in such a high price range. Take, for example, some of their Intra-Matic chronographs, which push well above the £2,000 mark, and yet use a fairly undecorated Veljoux-based movement with relatively few adjustments, by comparison to Longines, which for a little bit less will offer you a better finished watch in its entirety, in addition to a column wheel variation of that very movement, with a more appealing, you could say, dial arrangement, and full decoration. And this leaves me in a difficult position at the end of this podcast, because Hamilton are known for producing some really brilliant watches. Their pilot's watches, their field watches are known for being really fantastic pieces, and I urge anyone in the market for one of them to take a look and see if they like them, because they really are great watches. But as a brand, I must say they do seem to be in a very puzzling and difficult to understand position. But what do you think of Hamilton? Do you think that their product range is too large, or do you think it just needs to be more focused? Do you think they have a real brand image, or do you think they struggle with this Swiss-American side of things? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below on YouTube, or if you're listening to this as a podcast on your podcast player of choice, please remember to follow us there to always catch the latest and to make these podcasts possible. Thank you very much for listening. This is Armon from watchchronicle.com. Out.